Welcome to All Grown Up Now, a tale of retail, relocation, revenge, reinvention, reckless behavior, really good clothes, indiscretion, infidelity, domestic violence, and one kidnapping. I'm Kenneth D. King, podcasting from my studio near Union Square in New York City. This podcast is another in a series of installments from a novel I wrote called All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts, available on Amazon.com. It's the story of a small-town boy who dreams of being a grown-up and his journey to get there. Each week, you'll hear another installment of this story. I am pleased to announce that BearWorldMagazine.com will be one of the sponsors of all of the episodes going forward. In the last episode, Act 3 ends. But there is an epilogue, and this is episode 29. After the memorial service, Norma pulled me aside and reminded me of that first reading she had given me all those years ago. Remember I said there would be one day when he would come to you in a more humble position and you would have the power? Then the friendship would be on a more equal footing? She asked. Yes, now that you mention it, I do, I said. There were some years when I thought that might not come true. I thought I'd never see Mark alive again after I told him not to call unless he was ready to leave Victor. Well, sweetie, that's what Norma always called me. The karma is balanced here. She smiled and hugged me, and that felt good. Robert had a friend in the city who wrote for the newspaper The Examiner, a Hearst paper at the time. The woman did a story on Mark after he died, telling a bit of what he went through, trying to get away from Victor. Since I had inherited all of the piles of documentation, answering machine tapes, and paper from the various court dates and actions, I went through and annotated everything for her. When I gave it all over, I told her that before this went to press, she needed the lawyers to go over everything because Victor would indeed sue. She used this stack of documents as source material for the article. After vetting by the Examiner's legal department, the article went to press. It was a very sensitive article that gave a true picture of what he had gone through. Victor sued. No surprise, I told her he would. He sued the Examiner, the columnist, and me, each for $1.5 million. This envelope landed in my mailbox on my birthday. Since this was the first time, and I sincerely hope the last, that I had ever been sued, it turned my knees to rubber. This caused me to wake up with a start every 2 hours at night, thinking, I'm so fucked. After all the money I'd burned through during this chapter with Mark, I was tapped out. Happily, a lawyer from a very good, high-powered, expensive law firm called out of the blue one day, scaring the bejesus out of me, and offered to defend me pro bono. We also had the legal talent from the Examiner on our side as well. All that said, I still didn't relax totally until it was all over. The long and short of it was that after a year and a half of it trickling through the judicial system, Pizza Face was humiliated in court because he didn't call the day before to argue that the case shouldn't be thrown out. The excuse that he had was he couldn't call because he was on an airplane, perhaps it was Air Estonia. Since Pizza Face failed to do this, and the case was thrown out of court, under the California anti-SLAPP statutes, Victor had to pay all the costs, which were considerable. Now, we have the Scientologists to thank for that wonderful legislation, which defends deep-pocket people from threatening lawsuits to infringe on First Amendment rights. As for Mrs. Thames and Gordon, about a month after Mark died, Gordon phoned me from that God-forsaken hamlet outside of The Hague, you know, the one spelled with all consonants, Miss Thames had told him to phone me because of Mark. He wouldn't have known to do that on his own. After a very brief and passing mention of Mark's death, Gordon plunged into a long, torturous cataloging of the cosmetic surgeries and procedures he had undergone since we had last spoken in 1983. He kept saying things like, as if everyone engaged in recreational cosmetic surgery. At one point, I was so exasperated, I said, "Gordon, I don't know. I haven't had any work done. I don't need it. I look really good." There was a long pause. "I just wanted to be fabulous, and I've suffered," he said. He's suffered. Dear God in heaven. That statement got me off the phone in a hurry. And once I got off the phone, I got down on my knees and I prayed to God, "Thank you, God, that I'm not him. Thank you, God, that my parents were who they were and not those monsters who watered Gordon and watched him grow, throwing money at him instead of raising him." The AIDS got Gordon about a month after that. After he died, I started getting phone calls and letters from Mrs. Thames, pleading for help. It seems that she was now feeling guilty for not doing anything and letting Gordon stay with Ruloff, who now had, I assumed, inherited the house, the bank accounts, and everything else. Hearing her plead for help, usually on the answering machine as I was screening, or reading it in the letters, which I didn't answer, it sounded as though Mrs. Thames needed absolution and wanted it from me. I wasn't feeling like giving it to her. She had her chances, first to help Mark get that nutcase Victor off his back, and then to help Mark bring Gordon back to get him on the protease inhibitors. She made her choices, and she chose to let him die. I hoped she somehow had gained some insights from the results, but sadly, though, she didn't. I didn't ever return her calls, and had heard nothing more from her until this morning. As I'm writing this, 5 years after the fact, I thought she was finally history. Well, actually, I didn't think about her at all. However, this morning I came in early, the phone rang, and much to my surprise, it was her. Mrs. Thames was still, as she put it, having trouble over Gordon's death, and again I got the impression that she wanted absolution from me. She talked about how her husband and her daughter in Texas discouraged her from trying to get Gordon back to this continent, and then she dismissively mentioned Mark's little plan that probably wouldn't have worked anyway. There was apparently no awareness of her responsibility in all of this. After she mentioned that plan, I said, Mrs. Thames, that plan would have worked. Mark and I were working with a high-powered private eye and had already contacted Interpol. It would have worked. A beat skipped. "Now I feel worse about it," she said flatly. "It's a shame, Mrs. Thames," I continued. "I know of several people who were literally snatched from the jaws of death by the protease inhibitors. Gordon could have been one of them." Her next remark gave me whiplash. "Aruba is such a wonderful vacation spot," she exclaimed brightly. What? I thought. I thought I'd fallen into a parallel universe and the impact knocked the wind out of me. As I sat there, gasping from the whiplash, Mrs. Thames proceeded to tell me how Aruba was such a good tax haven and vacation spot and that I should go there. She cried poor a little, those pesky taxes and all that, but then told me of their delightful vacation house there and how I should look them up the next time I visited. I was so stunned by the abrupt change of topic, all I could manage was a weak indeed. She did mention that Victor contacted her a couple of months after Mark died to tell her the news. She told him that she'd already heard. She said also to move to the Midwest, change his name, and start over. That's when I let her know about the lawsuit and how it left me with the sword of Damocles over my head. Then there was the recap of how Mr. Thames was a psychopath she had chosen to live with all these years and how he had crushed her skull. This, again, was the story of how she went through the windshield of the car all those years ago. And she's still married to him. She still has the tooth problem. His name is Mr. Thames. I also got the dish on Ruloff. It seems he was expecting to inherit the house and everything, but, pity, it was all in Mrs. Thames's name. She may be odious, but she isn't stupid. I'm sure that was a rude surprise. Would he have hung around as long as if he knew? And more to the point, might Gordon still be alive because Ruloff had fled the scene? Mrs. Thames told me that she settled some money on Ruloff so he would go away quietly. There was a little more meaningless conversation, but all I really remember is my heart pounding and feeling really angry. Angry and disgusted. That fuckwit had no insight, nor desire to have insight, into how she herself allowed her son to die. Bringing it to her attention was pointless. She told me her phone number and email and asked me to keep in touch. Like I'm going to do that. And Robert. Betty, Robert's wife, called me one day about 6 months after Mark died. It was 9:30 in the evening in San Francisco, which meant it was much later in Florida. "Betty, what's wrong?" I asked. There was a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. "It's Robert. He's dead." Robert, after having a lovely day with the family and dinner, literally dropped over in his tracks. No warning, nothing, just boom. I think it would be the best way to go, but it's an absolute shock for everyone left behind. What a gent, Robert. Last time I saw him, we were headed to the airport after Mark's affairs were closed down. We were in the car. It was sunny and warm for December, so I had the top down. We were chatting in the driveway before starting out. Robert thanked me for all my help and said how much he had enjoyed getting to know me better. As I started the car, Robert looked over at me and said, "Ken, I'm not gay, but if I were gay, I would want to go out on a date with you. Take it as a compliment because that's how I intend it." What a wonderful guy, a real gent. It just broke my heart that my one connection to Mark was gone. It somehow made Mark's death even more final. And Victor. Thankfully, I don't hear from him. Last I heard was from a lawyer from the Hearst Corporation asking for any information I could supply that could help them get their whopping legal fees out of him. After getting out my files and telling all I knew, I said, "I hope you find him and get your money." They were owed about $26,000. "We are the Hearst Corporation," he chuckled. "We'll get our money." And finally, me. As I said at the beginning, life and reality began for me on May 5th, 1980, and I met Mark soon thereafter. In the 16 years we knew each other, I grew up. Knowing Mark all that time was the one constant on the journey. He was sometimes more than a brother, and sometimes less than a friend, but in the end, he was indeed the one constant in my life. Mark was there during my childhood and adolescence, Act 1. Distant while I was trying out my independence during my early adulthood, Act 2. And, in a way, the aged parent I cared for in Act 3. Then, the final curtain rang down on this particular show. During Act 1, I learned about seeing as an artist. Mark would tell me to not just look at something, but to see it. Take it in instead of just casting my eyes on something. This has enriched my creative life ever since. Act 2 taught me to accept that friends can have bad qualities, and one can get exasperated with them. One has to look at the person, warts and all, and really see them, and by seeing them clearly, decide whether one can continue with them or not. When I broke with Mark for that period of time, it was what I saw that made me know that I couldn't continue the friendship as it was. It didn't make me stop liking him or being concerned for him. I saw, though, that continuing as we were wasn't helping or changing things for either of us. In the third act, I saw clearly that being a grown-up wasn't the glittering, cool, carefree existence that I had envisioned as a child. Sure, I had a spiffy car and evening clothes. I hung around with glamorous people, went to the theater, opera, and restaurants, all the grown-up things I had dreamt about. But looking at this from the inside, I saw that the real measure of being a grown-up was something deeper and more profound. Along with the advantages of being an adult, I got a fuller understanding of the responsibilities, obligations, and unpleasant surprises that come with being a grown-up. Instead of being a grown-up, I'm all grown up now. The most important thing I learned in Act 3 was that doing the right thing is never easy, cheap, or popular. More importantly, doing the right thing is its own reward. Sometimes it's the only reward. I went to rescue Mark because I'd made a promise to him. I had promised that when he was ready to leave Victor, I'd be there. I'd like to believe that it was knowing I'd be there when he was ready to leave that helped him to survive. When he called, I knew that he was serious and that I had made a promise. It was the right thing to do. And he was a friend. Even though a long period of time had elapsed, this was a bond I hadn't broken. There was no question in my mind as to what to do. But when it was all said and done, after all the struggle and trouble, I didn't even have my friend back for very long. He was present as I remembered him in glimpses over his last few months, and totally during that last evening over dinner with his friends and me. I bitterly resent that I didn't get to keep him longer than I had him. I wanted him to restore his life so I could have the old Mark back, the one who opened the window of my escape. So we both could be on the same side of that window. Then we both could have been peers. But life isn't fair. Damn. But he died, and all I was left with was the knowledge that I had done the right thing. I had that and this experience, which strengthened me and will mark me forever. It has made me gutsier than I've ever thought possible and tougher, more open to taking big risks. There are big things I've done in my life since that have been made possible by the strength and power I claimed while helping Mark. For me, this has to substitute for the applause and the bow after the final curtain and the fun after party later where everyone would congratulate me on my fine performance. It never works out that way in real life. This is the end of the novel, All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts. I hope you at least enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And I hope, if nothing else, you got to know my friend Mark, because really, this was a tribute to him.